follow-ups. I also want to make the point that the disclosure that there were 300 instances in which there was some voluntary support succeeded in getting some sensational stories written, but the fact that it came without the accompanying analysis and without the accompanying data so that people really can't evaluate it is pretty unfortunate, because I've seen articles in which people leap to conclusions that may not be supported by the data. And I'd like to drill down a little bit into this topic, since you have raised this and seem to be making this an important basis for suggesting that we need some really extraordinary new regulations. The Boston Federal Reserve Bank recently cited that there were 47 instances of direct support between 2007 and 2010. In a recent speech, Federal Reserve Governor Tarullo referred to around 100 instances between 1989 and 2003. Moody's reported in 2010 that there were 181 cases between 1980 and August 2009. I guess my first question is everybody using the same definition of what constitutes support?
They may not be, and they may not also be looking at the entire universe of money market funds, as I said earlier.
So could you tell us what is the definition that you've used to define an instance of this voluntary support that gets you to this count of 300?
Yes, we have used, I believe, a pretty conservative evaluation, looking at those instances where money market funds came to the staff of the SEC and sought authority to essentially violate the affiliated transaction rules by making a contribution to the fund. We have generally talked about it as being buying out distressed paper, entering into a capital support agreement, or a letter of credit. We did not count renewals of capital support agreements, and we didn't count other types of potential contributions.
Okay, so a credit agreement is essentially a conditional support. If that was never drawn on, does it still count towards the 300?
Yes, because it still shows up as a liability on the balance sheet.
Okay, but but there was no credit event that occurred. There was no adverse outcome for the fund. It was simply an arrangement that was made and was never used in that case. Another question: do you distinguish between significant and de minimis amounts of support?
No, and I don't actually think that it's necessarily relevant to distinguish between them. If a fund is going to break the buck, it's going to break the buck, and capital support is there. It contributes to the understanding of investors.
I mean, if it's a de minimis arrangement, then it's not clear that the consequence would be breaking the buck. But let me ask another question. In the event that a sponsor had an agreement to purchase securities and the securities eventually paid in full, would that still count as one of these instances?
Yes, it would.
Okay. How about the number of instances since the 2010, right? Precisely how many of the 300 occurred after the new regulations were imposed in 2010?
My understanding is that since 2010, there have been 3 sponsor support occasions that were necessary because of a downgrade of a foreign bank. I believe it was a Norwegian bank.
But it's very hard for us to evaluate when you say necessary without understanding. I mean, we just went through a number of examples in which support is defined in ways that certainly wouldn't suggest to me, or I think to many people, that there was any real danger. And my concern is that this is the impression that is being created, that these are all instances about which we should be very, very concerned, when in fact it sounds as though many of them are not terribly disturbing.
Senator, as I said, I'm more than happy to provide the background information to you, but I think it's also important to note that money market funds come to us and ask us for the authority to enter into these arrangements. So these are not generated by the SEC. These are generated by
No, I understand. They're heavily regulated and they're forced to come to you for permission to do many things, but that doesn't mean the things that we're forced to request permission for are necessarily disturbing or evidence that there's a problem here. So you'll give us a public release of all the data and the analysis that accompanied it. When do you expect we'd be able to get a chance to look at that?
I would endeavor to get it to you as quickly as possible in the next couple weeks.
Okay. I just would like to make a general point and just wrap up my time. Your testimony, which I read closely, in my view, you're portraying an industry that's extremely vulnerable, that has all these risks of runs, And I really find that extraordinary in light of the actual history. When you think of the way this industry has thrived for decades that have seen so many extraordinary events, serious recessions, bouts of inflation, the crash of the S&L industry, all kinds of devastating natural disasters, 9/11, all the while, prior to the financial crisis of '08, there were thousands of bank failures, individual years in which hundreds of banks failed, and during all that time, one money market fund broke the buck. There was no run, there was no contagion, and investors got 96 cents out of every dollar. Then along comes the financial crisis. It's the worst since the Great Depression. Investment banks go down in smokes, commercial banks crumble. An entire industry is wiped out. The big wirehouse broker-dealers no longer exist, all either forced to be bought or convert their charter. And while the entire financial services sector is virtually collapsing and seizing up, the panic that seized this whole sector did in fact affect some of the money market funds somewhat. One of them broke the buck. Extraordinary measures were taken. I understand all that. And then you impose new regulations that you talked about, liquidity and maturity and credit enhancement, more transparency. And since then, we've had another round of real stresses. An ongoing terrible recession, European credit crisis, downgrade of the U.S. government, considerable redemption pressure, and not a single problem in this whole industry. No one gets in trouble. And now, without having had a chance to look at this data that you cite, and citing the very characteristics that have been in place from the very first day of this industry, you're telling us that this is a very vulnerable industry and there's great threats of a run, and using that to justify regulations that I think threaten the very existence of this industry.
Senator Menendez.